Order. For the record, I draw attention of the Treasury Bench and all members to paragraph 9.5 of the latest edition of the Ministerial Code, which states that copies of the text of an oral statement should be made available to the opposition and the Speaker's office at least 45 minutes before the statement is to be made. It is clearly highly regrettable that this did not happen today. I note the Home Secretary's previous apology made shortly before the suspension and now call the Home Secretary to make her statement.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. With permission, I'll make a statement on net migration, asylum and border security, and on the collapse in controls that took place over the last 5 years, the damage done as a result, and the action we are now taking to turn that round. Madam Deputy Speaker, last Thursday's official statistics show how over the last 5 years, controls in the immigration and asylum systems crumbled. Legal and illegal migration both substantially increased. The backlog in the asylum system soared, and enforcement of basic rules fell apart. Net migration more than quadrupled in just 4 years to a record high of nearly 1 million people, and it is still more than 3 times higher than in 2019. Dangerous small boat crossings rose from 300 people in 2018 to an average of over 36,000 a year in the last 3 years, a 120-fold increase. And in just a few short years, an entire criminal smuggler industry built around boat crossings has been allowed to take hold along the UK border. The cost of the asylum system has also quadrupled to £4 billion last year. In 2019, there were no asylum hotels. 5 years on, there are more than 200. Returns of those with no right to be here are 30% lower than in 2010. Asylum-related returns are down by 20% compared to 14 years ago. And that is the legacy that we inherited from the previous government, one that former ministers have themselves admitted to be shameful. We should be clear, Madam Deputy Speaker, this country has always supported people coming here from abroad to work, to study, or be protected from persecution. That has made us the country we are, from the Windrush generation to the kinder transport, from international medics working in our NHS, to the families we have supported from Ukraine. But that is exactly why the immigration and asylum systems have to be properly controlled and managed, so they support our economy, promote community cohesion with rules properly respected and enforced, and our borders kept strong and secure. None of those things have been happening for the last 5 years, and the scale of failure and loss of control has badly undermined trust in the entire system, and it will take time to turn things round. So let me turn to the changes that are needed in 3 areas. First, on legal migration. Recent years have seen what the ONS calls a large increase in both work-related and study-related immigration following the end of travel restrictions and the introduction of the new immigration system after the UK left the EU. Conservative government reforms in 2021 made it much easier to recruit from abroad, including a 20% wage discount for overseas workers. At the same time, training here in the UK was cut, with 55,000 fewer apprenticeship starts than 5 years ago, and the number of UK residents not working or studying hit a record high of over 8 million. This was an experiment gone badly wrong, built on a careless free market approach, which literally incentivised employers to recruit from abroad rather than train or tackle workforce problems here at home. Madam Deputy Speaker, this government is clear that net migration must come down. We're continuing with the visa controls belatedly introduced by the previous government, including the higher salary threshold, the 20% discount and the restrictions on dependent visas for students and care workers. But we must go further to restore order and credibility to the system. Since the election, we've set out new plans to ban rogue employers who breach employment laws from sponsoring overseas workers. We've reversed the previous Conservative decision to remove visa requirements from a number of countries where large numbers of people arriving as visitors were entering the UK asylum system instead, and we're reviewing visas further to prevent misuse. But we also need to overhaul the dysfunctional UK labour market that we inherited, including bringing together the work of the Migration Advisory Committee, Skills England, DWP, the new Industrial Strategy Council, to identify areas where the economy has become over-reliant on overseas recruitment and where new action will be needed to boost training and support. And that work will be at the heart of our new white paper, showing how net migration must and will come down as we set out new ways to link the points-based system with new requirements for training here in Britain. Let me turn to the asylum system. Last week's figures showed how the previous government crashed the asylum system in the run-up to the election. In their last 6 months in office, asylum decisions dropped by 75% and asylum interviews dropped by over 80%. So only a few hundred decisions were being taken a week instead of thousands. Caseworkers were deployed elsewhere and the backlog shot up. We've had to spend the summer repairing that damage, getting caseworkers back in place, restoring interviews and decisions, and substantially boosting returns. It will take time to deal with the added backlog and pressure on asylum accommodation that this collapse in decision-making caused. But the swift action we took over the summer has prevented thousands more people being placed in asylum hotels, saving hundreds of millions of pounds. So I'm also today publishing the full spending breakdown of the previous government's failed Rwanda partnership. In the 2 years the partnership was in place, just 4 volunteers were sent to Rwanda at a cost of £700 million. That included £290 million paid to the government in Kigali and almost £300 million in staff, IT and legal costs. The result of that massive commitment of time and money was 84,000 people crossed the channel from the day the deal was signed to the day it was scrapped. This so-called deterrent did not result in a single deportation or stop a single boat crossing the channel. For the British taxpayer, it was a grotesque waste of money. Since the election, we've swiftly deployed many of the people who were working on fantasy planning for the Rwanda scheme into working onto actual flights instead for those who have no right to stay in the UK, helping to deliver nearly 10,000 returns since the election. Enforced returns are up by 19%. Voluntary returns are up by 14%. Illegal working visits are up approximately 34%, and arrests from those visits are up approximately 25%. And I can tell the House this new programme to tackle exploitation and ensure the rules are enforced will continue and accelerate next year. And then turning to border security. 6 years ago, less than 300 people arrived on dangerous small boats, but since then, an entire criminal industry has taken hold and grown, with routes stretching through France, Germany and beyond, from the Kurdistan region of Iraq to the money markets of Kabul. They profit from undermining border security and putting lives at risk, and it's a disgrace they've got away with it for so long. So since the election, we've established the new Border Security Command, announced £150 million over the next 18 months for new technology and intelligence and hundreds of specialist investigators, struck new anti-smuggling action plan agreements with the G7 and bilateral agreements with Italy, Germany, Serbia and Balkan states, and increased UK operations with Europol and the Calais Group. In recent weeks, international collaboration has led to high-profile arrests and shown the smuggling gangs we will not sanction any hiding place from law enforcement. And I can tell the House today we've gone further. With a major new international collaboration, the Iraqi government and Kurdistan regional government share our concerns about the people traffickers operating through their country who have helped transport thousands of people across Europe and across the Channel. But joint action to tackle those problems has previously been far too weak. That's why last week I visited Baghdad and Erbil to sign new cooperation agreements on border security, migration and organised crime. As part of that, we will invest £500,000 helping the Kurdistan region enhance its capabilities on biometrics and security, and training Iraqi border staff to tackle organised immigration crime, with new commitments too on joint operations, information sharing, pursuing prosecution disruptions and further work on returns. These are landmark agreements, the first in the world for this Iraqi government focused on playing its part in the world. Most people in Britain want to see strong border security and a properly controlled and managed migration and asylum system where the rules are respected and enforced. So we do our bit alongside other countries to help those who fled persecution, but where those with no right to be here are swiftly returned, and it is governments, not gangs, who decide who can enter our country. For 5 years, none of those things have happened, and people have understandably lost faith in the entire system. So we have the chance now to turn that round, to fix the chaos, to bring net migration down, to tackle the criminal gangs and prevent dangerous boat crossings, to restore order, control and fair rules properly enforced. Not through gimmicks, but through hard graft and serious international partnerships. I commend this statement to the House.
I call the Shadow Home Secretary, Chris Philp.
Well, thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Speaker and you, Madam Deputy Speaker, for ensuring we had the proper time for considering the statement. Now, the Home Secretary seems to have a great deal to say about the last government and rather less to say about her own record since the election. But fortuitously, there was a large release of data last week which gives us an insight into the first 5 months of her time in office. And having looked at that, I can see why she is so silent on her own record. Let me start with small boats. It has been 150 days up to yesterday, since July the 4th, and in that time, a staggering 20,110 people have made the dangerous, illegal and unnecessary crossing. Over 20,000 since this government was elected. That is an 18% increase on the same 150 days last year, and it is a staggering 64% increase on the 150 days immediately prior to the election. Now, why is it that the numbers have gone up so much? Well, let's turn to what the National Crime Agency have said about this. They said no amount last year, no amount of funding or action against people smugglers will end crossing on its own. They went on to say, and I quote, "You need an effective removals deterrence." Now, the Labour government, after it was elected, cancelled that deterrent. They cancelled that Rwanda deterrent before it had even started. The first flight was due to go off on the 24th of July this year, but they cancelled it. And had that flight taken off as planned, we would not have seen the 64% increase that we have seen since the election, exactly as the National Crime Agency foresaw. But it's not just me, it's not just the National Crime Agency. Even Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, has called for European member states to implement an offshore processing scheme, a proposal which 18 European member states are said to support. So my first question is this: will the Home Secretary support and agree with the National Crime Agency and do what Ursula von der Leyen has urged and re-establish the scheme? Because as a consequence of her failure to reduce small boat numbers, the use of asylum hotels, which they promised to end, has gone up by 6,066 in the 3 months following the election. And the asylum backlog, which she had a great deal to say about, has gone up by 11,000 in the 3 months following the general election, something she didn't find time to mention. Now, she did talk a bit about her deal in Iraq. Her deal spends £500,000 with the Iraqi government. Now, that is not a great deal of money. It's what you'd spend probably on a road surfacing scheme in our constituency. And the idea that spending £500,000 is going to stop people smuggling from Iraq, I'm afraid, is naive and fanciful. What might have helped smash the gangs is having life sentences for people smuggling. So perhaps the Home Secretary could explain why in the last Parliament she voted against the bill that contained life sentences for the people smuggling gangs that she says she wants to smash. Now let me turn to the question of legal migration. And there I agree with her. The numbers have been far too high for many decades under successive governments. Now, it is welcome that the numbers for the most recent year have come down by 20%, but that is not far enough, and we need to go further. I do welcome the fact they're going to maintain most of the measures introduced by the last government that has seen that 20% reduction. We have also seen the number of visas go down. Visas, of course, are a leading indicator of migration. Work visas down 28% year on year. Student dependents down 84%. Student visas down 19%. And care visas down 84%, all thanks to measures introduced by the last government. But I would like to know why this government has decided to suspend the planned increase in the dependent visa salary threshold up to $38,700. It was due to take effect in April of next year, but they have suspended it. If they're serious about reducing net migration, as she says, why have they suspended that measure announced by my right honourable friend, the member for Braintree, in December of last year? And if they're really serious about reducing net migration as we are, what we really need is a hard cap on the numbers proposed by the Leader of the Opposition and I last week. So will they follow our suggestion and introduce that hard cap? So, Madam Deputy Speaker, behind all the bluster and all the chat about previous governments, we see her record and her government's record, a 64% increase in small boat crossings since the same period before the election, 6,000 extra people in hotels, the asylum backlog up by 11,000, all since the 4th of July. We see the deterrent, the Rwanda deterrent, which the National Crime Agency and even Ursula von der Leyen says is necessary, cancelled by this government before it even started. So I call on her to think again on those issues, to introduce those measures in April that the previous government announced and introduce this hard cap. If she is serious about combating illegal migration and getting the net legal migration figures down, she will adopt those measures.
Secretary.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I think if anyone believed that flights were going to go off to Rwanda this summer, the party opposite wouldn't have called the general election when they did. They would have hung on, hoping that it might happen. But it's just been the same thing time and again. They kept promising, they kept saying it was going to happen. But now everybody can see it was a total failure. It ran for over 2 years. And they kept promising the flights were going to go. They never did, but they just spent £700 million instead. They know so much, do they know, that this was a total failure. Their leader, their newly elected leader, won't even promise to reinstate it because she knows the whole thing was a con. And let me remind the Shadow Home Secretary too, the first half of this year, so the last 6 months of his government, crossings hit a record high for that season. If that trend had carried on, if that trend for the first half of the year for the record high had increased, had carried on through the summer, we would have had thousands more crossings that we would have been dealing with. Instead, because we had the increase for people arriving from Vietnam, this government introduced a major charter flight, return flight to Vietnam, and has been working with the Vietnamese government to make sure that those numbers from Vietnam can come down. We've also had to deal with a total collapse in their asylum decision-making that they left us with before the election, which has meant we have had to get caseworkers back in place that they had deployed elsewhere and let the backlog soar. But I would just say the Shadow Home Secretary then sort of wriggles a little bit around the net migration figures that have gone up to this record high, 900,000, because of the new rules that they brought in, that his government brought in 2021. Who was the Immigration Minister who brought in those rules? The Shadow Home Secretary.
Afzal Khan.
Madam Deputy Speaker, at a time of hugely stretched resources across the government, thanks to the mess left in the public finances by the party opposite, I welcome the additional money announced for investment in the Border Security Command and in strengthening our wider intelligence and enforcement capabilities against the smuggling gangs. So does the Home Secretary agree with me that is a far better use of taxpayers' money than paying people to go to Rwanda?
Well, my honourable friend is right. These criminal gangs, if you go back just 6 years, there was barely any of the boat crossings. This criminal infrastructure was not in place along our borders, and what we've seen is it take hold, or be allowed to take hold through several years and to build and to grow. And those gangs are getting away with undermining our border security and putting lives at risk. We should not be allowing them to get away with it, and that is why the cooperation led by the Border Security Command to go after the gangs, to pursue prosecutions and disruption is so vital to save lives and to strengthen our borders.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Lisa Smart.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Conservatives trashed our immigration system And now it's time to pick up the pieces. A period of quiet reflection might be appropriate from some benches for the next couple of minutes. Their chaotic approach of making and breaking targets shattered public trust and left the system in a right shambles. Rwanda, small boats and asylum hotels are phrases that took on new, shameful meanings over the last Conservative government. Net migration figures hit record highs on their watch, skyrocketing, particularly after they took the UK out of the EU. Yet still, the Conservatives' arbitrary rules make it nearly impossible for some sectors to recruit the workers they need, like in hospitality. So it's clear that change is desperately needed. We need to rebuild an immigration system that works for our country and for our economy, a fair, effective system that welcomes the workers we need. And I'm thinking about the really senior surgeon who undertook the kidney transplant that my dad had that kept him alive. That surgeon came here as an immigrant. We also need a system that clearly and properly enforces the rules. We need a system that sees our university sector as a jewel in the crown, welcoming students from overseas and as a way of using the UK's soft power for good. So it's right that the government is taking steps to make it easier to recruit British workers to fill vacancies, and a really thorough workforce strategy is sorely needed. But will the government consider implementing Liberal Democrat calls for a carer's minimum wage to help address the well-documented needs of the social care sector? I'm really pleased the Home Secretary also talked about how we'll have to work closely with our international partners to stop the dangerous channel crossings, something the previous Conservative government made it harder for us to do time and again. International cooperation is crucial, but our response to these criminal gangs, who are profiting from some of the very most vulnerable, must go further too. We need to crack down on modern slavery here in the UK, which is how these gangs make a big chunk of their money. And I hope the government will cut off these gangs' power at the source by providing safe and legal routes for genuine refugees. The government has a mammoth task ahead, rebuilding not only an immigration system that works, but also, really importantly, the public's trust in the process.
I welcome many of the points that the honourable member has made, and she is right to point to the lack of trust and confidence in the system as a result really of the chaos of the last few years, as well as the real loss of controls, the loss of the practical measures in place. She particularly raised the issues around the migration for work. The migration for work quadrupled in the space of 4 or 5 years, at the same time as we had drops in the number of adults in training and also the drops in apprenticeship starts. That is a system that is broken. We do agree that we should have support fair pay agreements in social care and a proper workforce strategy around social care to ensure that we can better recruit and support care workers who are UK resident. We have also already I've asked the Migration Advisory Committee to look particularly at the engineering and IT sectors, because those are sectors where we have had persistently high levels of recruitment from abroad, where we frankly should have had far better and longer standing training here in the UK.
Nadia, Whittome. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Does the Home Secretary agree with me that the public is right to be angry about the state of public services, and the blame lies squarely with 14 years of cuts and mismanagement by Conservative governments, not migrants who contribute to their new home? And will she stand up to attempts by members on the benches opposite to distract from their own failures and divide the country by scapegoating people who just want a better life for themselves and their families, as we all do?
Well, she's right that the previous government in 14 years did deep damage, not just to our public services, but also to our economy as well. And they have to take responsibility for that. We've also have a history going back through generations where people have come to the UK to work, to study, and to get protection from persecution. But it's because those systems are important, an important part of who we are, that they do also need to be controlled and managed. And that is why a long alongside the damage they have done to our economy and public services, it's also, we have seen the damage to the relationship between the migration system and the labour market, which has also ended up with the loss of control too.
Chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, Dame Karen Bradley.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. With regards to the agreement with Iraq, I note that the estimated spend is around £800,000, which compares to, I think, £476 million being spent with non-agreement with France. So has the Home Secretary made an estimate of how much she expects this money will contribute to reducing the numbers crossing the Channel?
So what we've found in the discussions with both the Iraqi government and the Kurdistan regional authorities is that they want to tackle organised immigration crime in their country. They are concerned not just about people trafficking and people smuggling, but also about drug trafficking, and sometimes it'll be the same gangs who are linked to this, and also money laundering. So what we found was actually a strong willingness to work with us, where actually the most important thing will be to get the coordination, the cooperation, information sharing, and the standards and intelligence in place. That will be the first start. This is the beginning of a partnership. So the funding we have set out is for the first step in that partnership to get the better biometrics, the better training capabilities, the better border security working in place. But we see this as being an important partnership that needs to grow.
Linsey Farnsworth.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As an international liaison prosecutor, my job was to facilitate international cooperation, working with the NCA and overseas authorities. Does the Home Secretary agree with me that this is the key to smashing the criminal people smuggling gangs and not gimmicks like the Rwanda scheme?
Yeah. Well, I completely agree. To spend £700 million just sending 4 volunteers, I mean, it's the most astonishing, shocking waste of money. But she's also right that, look, these criminal gangs operate across borders. That is what they do. But law enforcement across borders is far, far too weak. It's been far too much each country looking inwards rather than getting the cooperation in place. And so the gangs are able to run rings round law enforcement far too many places across the world. We have to strengthen that cooperation across borders in order to tackle those gangs.
Father of the House, Sir Edward Lee.
I agree with the Home Secretary that the failure of the last government to control immigration was unconscionable, and our new leaders rightly apologised for our failure, although some of us on the back benches did warn the government at the time, but there we are. That's for the past. For the future, I agree we all want to return illegal migrants and where they come to, but will the Home Secretary list the countries where human rights lawyers say they are so unsafe that we can't return them to those countries? And so what is the deterrent for those countries? We don't have an offshoring policy.
Well, obviously each individual case needs to be decided on a case-by-case basis. But what we do know, for example, for Iraq, there are people who have been, has been agreed through the courts who could be returned to Iraq, safely returned to Iraq, but the process is extremely slow, or the bureaucracy is extremely slow. We also know there are many people who are in the immigration enforcement system currently, but who the previous system, it just wasn't following up and it wasn't taking the action. And that's why we've been able to substantially increase the returns in a short period of time. Of course, each case has to be looked at on its merits, but we do believe we can do substantially more to make sure that the rules are properly respected and enforced.
Arthur.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for her statement, and I make my response within the context of my register of interest. And I would also like to thank the Secretary of State for talking about the UK's strong history in welcoming people here who are trying to escape persecution. And we also shouldn't forget that the organised people smuggling into this country, at the heart of it, people are being exploited and also people are dying. And we've seen it in the final days of the last government. They were just sloganising around the people coming in hero boats, and also sloganising about the absolutely shameful Rwanda scheme. It brought shame on our country. And I was absolutely appalled to hear the member on the opposite benches trying to defend that scheme. And I was absolutely shocked as well to hear the fact that the number of students coming to the UK dropping was something to be celebrated. Sorry.
Order. Home Secretary.
Well, clearly, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Rwanda scheme did fail, and the leader of the opposition knows that it failed, and that is why she does not want to reinstate it, contrary to the Shadow Home Secretary's views, who seems to want to spend another $700 million for another 2 years to send another 4 volunteers to Rwanda. The criminals that organise the boats are incredibly dangerous. We've seen children crushed to death. We've seen people drown as a result of these flimsy and dangerous boats. And those gangs are making hundreds of millions of pounds of profit. They're getting away with it. We should not be letting them get away with it. That is why we need to work across borders to go after them.
Farron.
Madam Deputy Speaker, migration does, however, play a significant part in our economy. In the Lake District, 66% of hospitality and tourism businesses report that they are failing to meet capacity, or rather to meet demand, because of lack of workforce capacity. Migration is part of the answer. Would she listen to leaders of the Cumbria hospitality and tourism economy and meet with them to look at how we can look at options like, for example, a youth mobility visa scheme that would give us the ability to shore up our workforce, which is brilliant, but far too small?
Well, all I would say to him is I think there are some deep and fundamental problems in the UK labour market that we have inherited, because he is talking about workforce shortages at a time when net migration has quadrupled, at a time when overseas recruitment for work has quadrupled. And therefore, I think what that shows is there is a much bigger challenge in the workforce, where you've got the huge drop in training, where we don't have proper strategic approaches to the workforce, and that is what we should be putting in place instead. Looking at issues around training, looking at the issues around pay and conditions, looking at the key sectors to make sure that they get support, rather than continually looking to increase migration instead.
Gregor Poynton.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The former Conservative Immigration Minister has said the country is right to be furious about his party's record in immigration, and they need to own their failures and change. What is about the Conservatives' obsession with their failed and costly Rwanda programme that shows that heeded his warning and changed their approach?
Well, my old friend is right. I think the former Immigration Minister and Shadow Justice Secretary said the net migration figures were a day of shame for the Conservative Party. They might need a little bit more shame on the front benches.
Sir Gavin Williamson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Could the Home Secretary set out how many hotels have been moved into housing asylum seekers since the 4th of July, and will she commit to updating the House regularly as to which hotels have been repurposed into that use?
Well, I know that the Immigration Minister has already answered, I think, some of the questions he has raised, and he is right to raise concern about asylum hotels. There are now 220 asylum hotels in use. He will know that his government opened 400 asylum hotels, and we have had to deal with the collapse in asylum decision-making. In the last few months before the general election, they went to taking just a few hundred decisions a week, rather than to be taking thousands of decisions each week. That was deeply damaging, and we have had to deal with that so that we can turn things around in order to make sure we clear the asylum backlog and end hotel use.
Barry Gardner.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's clear that my right honourable friend inherited a chaotic immigration situation from the last government, and I commend her for the work that she's doing. She rightly focused on international cooperation, but principally around removals. Does she accept that in a world that is so interconnected as ours, migration can no longer adequately be managed by treaties which are now more than 70 years out of date, and that we need to cooperate with our international partners to create a new structure and a new settlement for managing global migration?
Well, my honourable friend makes important points, because I think countries do need to work together and do need to look far more about some of the causes of migration. It's why we set out at the European political community additional £80 million fund to look at earlier prevention work, to look at how we address some of the causes of migration in the first place, as well as the law enforcement response that we need to go after the criminal gangs.
Pete Richard.
The absurd and chaotic Brexit, fully supported of course by this government front bench, was supposed to finally satisfy this obsession with Brexit, but ending freedom of movement is actually going to increase the numbers of people coming here. What is the point of the Brexit, and why has it so spectacularly failed to manage to get a hold on immigration to the UK?
Well, I think that the previous government, the Conservative government, made a decision in 2021 to launch what was effectively a free market approach to immigration. And they made it much easier to recruit from abroad, and they also introduced incentives for employers to recruit from abroad by introducing a 20% wage discount at the same time as they were cutting training and cutting support as well. So the consequence is we have indeed, since 2021, seen a massive increase in overseas recruitment at the same time as we've seen a drop in people getting the training and support to work in the UK.
Alice MacDonald.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the frank assessment that this government has brought to the situation and the setting out of clear measures. As we have heard, criminal gangs are causing untold misery to people all around the world. Can she expand on the measures that we are taking, particularly with European neighbours, to crack down on these criminal gangs once and for all?
Well, we have been working with other European countries. We have a new agreement in place with Italy about going after illicit finance that is underpinning many of the criminal gangs. The work that Prime Minister Maloney has done already has helped to significantly reduce Mediterranean crossings, and we are working with Italy. We do think this work is important. We're also working with Germany on supply chains and with Bulgaria on supply chains, including the way in which boats and engines are being moved across Europe. And of course, we are working with France on tackling the organised gangs, which includes some of the Iraqi Kurdish gangs that are operating in northern France, in order to be able to pursue those gang networks as well to prevent dangerous crossings.
Lewis Cooking.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Asylum Hotel in Cheshunt, in my constituency of Broxbourne, is already putting pressure on strained public services, including local GP surgeries. The government's manifesto committed to closing asylum hotels, so can I ask the Secretary of State when she will be honouring that promise, or will that list get longer of broken promises to the British people?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, we are determined to clear the backlog so that we can end asylum hotels. In 2019, there were no asylum hotels. So the previous government increased those and opened around 400 of them. There are still around 220 asylum hotels in place. We have had to deal with the shocking crashing of the asylum system just before the election, where they effectively stopped a whole lot of caseworkers making decisions on asylum cases and pushed the backlog up. So we've had to clear that now over the summer as well. That means we can then make progress in order to bring that backlog down so that we can start to clear hotels and to make sure that we save money from the taxpayer, where we have already saved the taxpayer hundreds of millions of pounds this year.
Emma Foodie.
Madam Deputy Speaker, as part of the £700 million spent by the previous government on the failed Rwanda scheme, was the Home Secretary as surprised as me to hear about the package of support that the 4 volunteers that went to Kigali received? That included 5 years of free housing, free food, free private healthcare, free university education, free vocational training, all at a cost of £150,000 per person. Does she agree with me that Rwanda was not in any way a deterrent, but an absolutely colossal waste of money?
Well, my honourable friend is right. This was a total shocking waste of money to just send 4 volunteers and they had 1,000 people working on the Rwanda scheme. That was 1,000 people who could have been working on enforcement, could have been working on returns, could have been working on clearing the backlog, could have been working on action to pursue the criminal gangs, and instead they were working on a scheme that ran for 2 years and still just sent 4 volunteers.
Nigel Farage.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I agree with the Home Secretary. She's right to highlight that 2023 was a year of shame for a government that had repeatedly promised net migration of tens of thousands a year, not nearly 1 million. Perhaps they'll never be forgiven for it. But if I also look at 2023, I see that asylum claims were 84,000 people. Everyone talks about the small boats, and yet 69% of that 84,000 did not come across the English Channel in boats. Can she tell me, please, where did they come from? Were they overstayers? Were they student visas? Who were the 69%?
From what? Well, we are clear that net migration needs to come down after the huge increase. We also need to restore order to the asylum system. Part of that is going after the criminal gangs who are undermining border security and putting lives at risk and tackling the small boat crossings. But there is also an issue about the increases that we have seen around in-country asylum applications, and we have instigated a review into the increase in-country asylum applications to get to the bottom of what is happening and why. There were 2 areas where we found that the previous government's decision to remove visa requirements for visitors had led to a significant increase in asylum applications for people who were coming as visitors. Instead, we have reversed those changes that were made by the previous Conservative government and reintroduced visitor visa requirements for those countries.
John Slinger.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As the chair of the APPG for the Kurdistan region in Iraq, I welcome my right honourable friend's recent visit and the agreements that flowed from that. Does the Home Secretary agree that UK and allies' support for the Kurdistan regional area in Iraq across all spheres, plus the efforts of our own government and allies to strengthen relationships between Baghdad and Erbil, fosters greater prosperity and stability, helps reduce corruption, and thereby helps alleviate some of the push factors that cause migration in the first place to this country?
Oh, my honourable friend makes a very important point. I want to thank the Kurdish regional government for their hospitality and welcome, and also to thank the Iraqi government for their welcome and support for my visit last week. And we had really important and serious discussions with both the regional authorities and the Iraqi government on the range of issues, yes, on tackling organised immigration crime, but also on the positive work that both the Iraqi government and the Kurdish regional government want to do to support economic prosperity, and the point that they make repeatedly, which is security is the foundation of economic growth as well, and that is why they are also so keen to tackle organised immigration crime and other forms of organised crime that can end up undermining their security and their economic opportunities.
Dr. Andrew Morrison.
Given promises made at the general election, the opening of more asylum hotels is deeply regrettable. As the Home Secretary seeks alternative accommodation to be able to close down those hotels, will she assure the House that she will not overdo her requests of other government departments, in particular the Ministry of Defence, which has historically been very helpful in finding surplus accommodation to house migrants? I hope she agrees enough is enough, and that she will not disadvantage service families in their accommodation needs.
Well, I agree with him about the importance of support for our armed forces, and including housing for armed forces families. That will always be important. All I would say to him around asylum accommodation is the number of asylum decisions had dropped by 70% in the space of just 6 months. That is a massive drop. Of course, what that did was that increased the backlog over the summer as a result of that crashing of asylum decisions. We have now managed to get the asylum decisions right up back to where they were. We have managed now to get the asylum caseworkers back in place and to have those decisions taking place now rapidly. That puts us now in a position to be able to get the backlog down, to be able to make sure that we can take action on asylum hotels, and means we are already saving hundreds of millions of pounds this year compared with the previous government's plans.
Samantha Niblett.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In the run-up to the summer general election, my constituents in South Derbyshire were hugely concerned about the number of small boats crossing the Channel. And little wonder, because the party opposite left office in the middle of the worst year ever for small boat arrivals. 18% higher than in 2023, 5% higher than in 2022, and more than double the level in 2021. Since the Labour government came into office just under 5 months ago, the number of arrivals is now lower than in 2021, more than a third lower than in 2022, and only 15% higher than 2023, rather than 19% that we inherited. So would the Home Secretary agree that that all sounds like pretty decent progress to me?
Well, thank my honourable friend for that point, because look, she's right. The first 6 months of the year was a record high for that season. Of course, we know that the crossings is seasonal, but it was a record high for that first half of the year. If we had carried on at a record high level, so higher than 2023, higher than 2022, higher than 2021, if we'd carried on higher than each of those years, then we would have thousands more people in the asylum system right now. We would have to deal with thousands more dangerous boat crossings as well. And there were some independent projections when we took office in the middle of the year saying that crossings could have been as many as 50,000 this year. That hasn't happened. That actually, though, is still no real consolation, because so many lives are still being lost and so many gangs are still making huge profits. And that is why we have to take the action on the gangs. We have to strengthen border security and prevent so many lives being put at risk.
Wendy Chamberlain.
Speaker, now effective technology is at the centre of an excellent asylum and immigration system, and I was at the Minister's drop-in in relation to e-visas, which I'm sure many of us welcome. There was reassurances there that those who haven't yet had their e-visa and are transitioned from a paper wouldn't be disadvantaged, but the reports suggesting otherwise that we've seen today, and that's of particular concern to the Afghan community, particularly those who came since the rise of the Taliban. Can I get reassurance that people will not be disadvantaged if they don't have their e-visa processed by the end of January?
Well, the honourable member makes an important point here, and she will know that the Minister is working immensely hard to make sure that any areas where there are concerns are dealt with. We are clear that no one should be disadvantaged by the transfer to this new electronic system, which will strengthen security and will strengthen the information that people rightly have, but we need to make sure that it happens as smoothly as possible. I would urge her to continue to keep in touch with my right honourable friend so that we can make sure that every single issue within the system and with the transfer to e-visas is properly addressed.
Paul Wall.
Deputy Speaker, when the net migration figures were published last week, and they were truly shocking, the Shadow Justice Secretary, the former Immigration Minister, did say on Twitter, now known as X, it was not just a day of shame for the Conservative Party, but it was also a day of shame because they'd let the country down badly and caused immense and lasting harm with its immigration policies that had left Britain poorer. Would the Home Secretary agree with me it's better to train up our own people in this country than repeat the failed Tory policies that left us all poorer?
Well, my honourable friend is right. We need a complete overhaul of the way that training and support for work takes place to get UK residents back into work, to make sure they can get the training that they need and we don't have this chaos in the net migration system as well. I think something else that the former Immigration Minister has said is that they will only rebuild trust opposite once they own up to their failures. Perhaps a little bit more owning up that we need to hear today.
Julia Lopez.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Now, in the last Parliament, Labour consistently voted down stricter border laws, and they signed bleeding heart letters trying to prevent the deportation of criminals from this country. And in government, they cancelled restrictions on family routes, and they've removed the offshore processing option. So I confess I am deeply sceptical that Labour will be successful in controlling immigration. Now, the Iraq deal sounds promising as a headline, but truly, what difference will £500,000 to the Iraqi government make in terms of the volume of channel crossings?
Well, I would again sort of say to her that this is about establishing the new cooperation and networks, not just across Europe, but also beyond. We know that there are significant Iraqi Kurdish gang networks that operate in northern France. We know that the Kurdistan regional authorities and the Iraqi government are particularly concerned about this. They're concerned about the routes back into northern Iraq. They are concerned about the impact it is having on their country, as well as the impact that we are concerned about that it is happening in the Channel. That is why at the start of this is getting that law enforcement working in partnership together. And that is what we can now build on. This is the first agreement that Iraq has done with any country around tackling organised immigration, crime and border security. I was really welcome their support for this and their determination and commitment to do this. We need to work in partnership with them on it.
Amanda Martin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Residents in Portsmouth North are concerned about the rising cost of housing asylum seekers. Although it's not what we would have wanted as a government, it's good that we have been open and apologetic about having to open on a temporary basis to house these people, because of the lack of inactivity from the previous government. Does the Home Secretary agree that this is firstly in stark contrast to the previous government, who never explained and never apologised, even when there were more than 400 hotels costing £9 million a day? And, Madam Deputy Speaker, can the Home Secretary say when we expect to see the cost of housing asylum seekers reduce?
Well, we are already saving hundreds of millions of pounds this year from the asylum accommodation budget as the result of the decisions that we have already taken to restart asylum decision-making and to get the system working again so that we can start clearing the backlog. Had we not done so, had we carried on with the previous government's policies, we would have seen those costs soar further. That is unfair on the British taxpayer, as well as the sign of a broken asylum system. We will continue to do that. We expect to make hundreds of millions of pounds more savings next year. In total, the assessment is that over the next few years we are saving £4 billion from the previous government's failed schemes.
Desmond Swain.
What deterrent will she implement for those asylum claimants who have destroyed their papers and purport to come from regimes to which they cannot possibly be returned?
Well, one of the reasons that we are talking to the Iraqi government and the Kurdistan regional authorities about biometrics and supporting biometric rollouts is because that makes it easier then to prevent people delaying either asylum claims being resolved or returns being agreed by not having papers. And where there are biometrics in place, that makes things much faster. And that is why we should be working to extend those, and why we are also working to establish stronger returns arrangements with other countries, which is what we have been doing through the summer, and why we have seen such a substantial increase in returns this summer as a result of us putting the additional resources that were failing to achieve anything on the Rwanda scheme, now actually putting them into doing practical things as part of returns and enforcement.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In his statement, the Shadow Home Secretary said that £500,000 wasn't a lot of money. And that's probably because he thought that for £100,000 more, you could give free education, housing, university education, vocational training to just 4 volunteers to go to Rwanda. What an absolute waste of money. Does the Home Secretary agree with me that it is a far better deterrent to actually process people and send them abroad? Or should we continue with the fallacy that we should be bribing people as a nation to send them over to Rwanda?
Well, he's certainly right that the £700 million for 4 people is absolutely not good value for money at all, and we will always make sure that we are looking for good value for money as well as getting results.
Sammy Wilson.
Mr. Speaker.
The previous administration cannot Pontius Pilate-like wash its hands of the immigration mess that we have, and which has placed intolerable burdens on mostly disadvantaged working-class communities. But the government now has responsibility for this. It can't pass it back again. The government has responsibility. And what I would like to hear from the Minister today is that despite what has happened since July, 20,000 more immigrants coming into the United Kingdom, hotel places up, foreign criminals still waltzing through the courts claiming human rights to stop themselves being removed. What does she intend to do to remove the pull factor which encourages people to see Britain as an easy touch?
Well, I would say to him one of the things that we are doing is cracking down on the illegal working and exploitation by employers of people coming to the UK who are often not here lawfully and as a result are being exploited by employers. That has been too easy for employers to do that for far too long. That is why we've had more than 30% increase in illegal working visits over the summer and significant increase in the arrests as a result of those visits, and also a significant increase in penalties for employers as a result of that. And we will continue to take much stronger action, including also making sure that we are removing the sponsorship ability for any employer that is breaching the important employment laws as well, because we do need to make sure that every bit of the system is being tackled and being addressed so that we make sure that we have a system that is fair and has public support.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Home Secretary ended her statement saying that she wanted serious international partnerships. But when pushed on this by the Shadow Home Secretary, she seemed reticent to say whether she would explore removal or processing agreements with third countries, as advocated for by the President of the European Commission. So who is actually serious on this question, this government or Ursula von der Leyen?
Home Secretary. Well, we have been very clear about the importance of working with other countries, both on tackling gangs and also on addressing some of the wider issues that we face. That's why we've always said we would look at anything that works, we will look at practical measures. It's why we've recognised there are different approaches being taken by different countries. For example, there is the Italy-Albania agreement that has been put in place. And interestingly, one of the things that does is introduce effectively, the idea is to have a fast-track returns arrangement for those from predominantly safe countries to be able to be moved to Albania. We think it's possible to also introduce fast-track arrangements that have never properly been in place in this country for a very long time, and we should be looking at those as well.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Over 210,000 Ukrainians have been hosted in the UK since Russia's full-scale invasion, and this is a testament to the generosity of British hosts. But the millions of Ukrainians who have left Ukraine for Europe is just a fraction of those who might flee across Europe if Russia was successful at breaking through and occupying all of Ukraine. Does the Secretary of State see it as in the UK's own national interest that we confiscate all of Russia's frozen assets and offer the proceeds to the defence of Ukraine and prevent further displacement?
Well, as the Honourable Member will know, we strongly support Ukraine in what they have had to endure and to go through, and we continue to support Ukraine. We continue to condemn the Russian government and the Putin government for the things that they have done and the impact that they are having on Ukraine, and we will continue to support Ukraine in every way possible.
Lincoln Job.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. A constituent wrote to me recently asking if I could get a hurry-up on his application under the EU settlement scheme. Turns out that he's actually subject to a deportation order. And we actually did deport him in 2018. He managed to get back into the country somehow and make his application under the EU SS. And the Home Office told me last week that they can't deport him until his application under the EU SS has been played out, including all the appeals. So he made his application in 2020. It's now nearly the end of 2024. In the spirit of bipartisanship, can I suggest that the Home Secretary changes the rules with the stroke of her pen, and that anyone who is subject to a deportation order just gets deported? And in the similar spirit, if she can get it done by Friday, I'll gladly drive him to the airport myself.
Well, what I would say to the honourable member is they've obviously had 14 years, or at least 4 years, since the EU settlement scheme was introduced. So they have had time, supposedly, for the previous government to be able to deal with some of these issues. But we actually do take very seriously the need to better speed up and enforce returns for those who have no right to be here. The immigration system and the asylum system can only really work and have public confidence if the rules are respected and the rules are enforced. So that means where someone doesn't have a right to be here, there should be proper enforcement. So we are working to speed up the enforcement. That is why we've had the significant increase in returns over the summer, but we will continue to do so, and we will continue to look at what further amendments can be made to improve things.
Richard Tice.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Home Secretary has quite rightly lambasted the absolute failures of the last government of mass immigration. But could she comment on whether or not people in the Home Office will be held accountable for allowing systems and controls to crumble in the last 5 years, and whether people will be held accountable in the Office for National Statistics that got their numbers wrong by almost 250,000 people in just 1 year?
Well, I think it was government ministers opposite who made the policy decisions that they then asked Home Office officials to implement. So fundamentally, the Conservative government does need to take responsibility for policy decisions that they made in 2021 that led to the big increase in migration for work, for example, and the big increase in the net migration numbers that we saw at the same time as training was being cut in the UK. That has had, I think, damaging consequences in terms of confidence, in terms of trust, but also actually in the functioning of the UK economy and the UK labour market, because we should be doing far more to train people, everything from engineering, construction, a whole series of different areas. We should be increasing training here in the UK.
Blake Stevenson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Will the Home Secretary confirm how many country deals are being worked on to ensure people can be returned to their country of origin, and when she would expect these to have a material impact on the level of migration to the UK?
Well, the work we are doing with different countries, some of it is actually just about speeding up existing returns arrangements, which sometimes don't work effectively enough. Sometimes it will be relatively practical improvements in existing arrangements that just take far too long or have too many hurdles in them. So we are already doing that, and that is why we have had the significant increase in returns over the summer. It's why we've also organised a series of charter flights, including the 3 largest charter return flights in UK history have been all organised since the general election as part of the practical work we are doing step by step to increase enforcement and returns.
Luke Taylor.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Whilst we're reassured by the previous answers to questions that the Home Secretary is committed to increasing processing of asylum claims to clear through the backlog, Liberal Democrats will push you to go further and faster. Will you consider calls from the Liberal Democrats to end the ban on asylum seekers working, reduce the time limit to 3 months so they're able to contribute to their cost of living, integrate into societies and start to pay a fair share within the communities that they wish to join?
No, I don't think that is the right thing to do, because I think what we need to do is to clear the backlog, to speed up the decision-making and ensure that those who don't have a right to be here are swiftly returned. Where we've had people arrive, for example, from Ukraine or from Hong Kong, of course we want to see them working, being part of the economy and being able to support themselves and their families. But where somebody is here who doesn't have a right to be here, then I think the important thing is to make the system work and make sure they can swiftly return.
Jack Rankin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Villages like Datchet in my constituency are bearing the brunt of the increase in 6,000 illegal economic migrants in asylum hotels since this government came to office. Given these single adult males represent something like 2% of the village population, What assessment has she made on the extra pressures on vital local services, particularly GPs and dentists? And what assurances can she give my constituents that they won't miss out on vital appointments as a result of this sudden demographic change?
Well, we think that the asylum hotels are the wrong way to be responding to the system that we have, and that's why the increase in the backlog as a result of the previous Conservative government's collapse in decision-making has been so damaging. And that is why we have now got the additional caseworkers back in place, why we have got asylum decisions now being taken and back up to the levels that they were, so that we can clear the backlog and so that we make sure we don't need to use these asylum hotels, which have, to have the previous government opened 400 asylum hotels and quadrupled the cost of the asylum accommodation system. That is a shocking, shocking impact on the taxpayer, and we are already saving money from bringing those costs down.
Max Wilkinson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We need a firm but fair and compassionate approach on immigration. I think we would all agree in this House. Human rights NGOs have warned that people returned to Iraq could be at risk of human rights abuses. So could the Home Secretary tell us what reassurances she's had on that point? And will human rights always be a red line when she is striking migration deals in future?
So the agreement that we reached with and signed with the Iraqi government explicitly commits to support for international law, for international humanitarian law and human rights, and it's one of the issues that we discussed as part of the meetings as well. You will also know that in terms of the asylum system, every decision is made on its individual merits to make sure that where somebody is being rejected for the asylum system and is being returned, that it is safe and appropriate to do so. But we do believe that there are many people currently in the immigration enforcement system who should be safely returned to their homes. That's why we have increased the process around enforcement and returns this summer.
To end, we have Jim Shannon.
Very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm sure that's a thrill for everybody. Can I just say to the Secretary of State, thank you so much for your statement. And whilst the failures of the previous government may undoubtedly be a reason for this uncontrollable migration number, my constituents in Northern Ireland who have had their winter fuel allowance removed, who are seeing an increase in the cost of living that is pushing many working families towards the poverty line at warp speed, these people, my constituents, are not interested in a blame game, but they are interested in getting immigration sorted and the boat stopped. So will the Secretary of State say what the government will do to achieve a reasonable immigration policy? And how will they deal with those who have not come here legally and who do not deserve to be here in front of the families of Afghanistan who were instrumental in the war effort there and are still waiting in the correct procedural queue rather than jumping off boats?
So, in response to the point that the Honourable Member makes, the enforced returns for those with no right to be here are up 19% this summer. Voluntary returns are up 14% because we do think those should increase. In terms of the overall immigration system, we will also be setting out in a white paper new proposals to better link the Migration Advisory Committee, the skills bodies across the UK and other organisations to identify stronger controls but also linked to stronger training requirements. So as well as having the visa controls in place, we also have clear requirements to train here in the UK to make sure that we can tackle that big increase in net migration for work that we saw over the last 5 years. I think he would probably agree. Most people across the country, they want to see strong border security and they want to see a properly controlled and managed immigration and asylum system. We haven't had that for too long, but those are the proper controls and fair systems that we need to get back in place so we fix the foundations and everybody can have confidence in the system for the future.
That is the end of that statement. I'll give the front benches a few moments to quickly and quietly shuffle over.